All right, we'll jump straight into it. So an email was distributed a little earlier today with a link to a web page that presents the slides for today's presentation. You can open that link directly in your favorite browser, either on a desktop, laptop, or mobile phone. Or Susanna has already set up a screen share. During the course of the presentation, I'll mention next slide, and then you can manually on your end transition to the second, to the third, to the fourth slide that we'll be talking about. You will continue to have access to the slides on your desktop. So if ever you need to refer to the concepts or the themes that have been brought up for conversation today, you'll continue to have access to that resource. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, in terms of an introduction, is I'm currently a CEO and chairman at CNC Incorporated. It's a market access firm based in Boston, Porto, and also Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And what we do is improve medicine access by strengthening pharmaceutical systems. And there are a few two predominant areas that we focus on is doing pharmacoeconomic evaluations from an applied perspective, and the second major stream of activity is workshops, education and training and capacity. I'm also an affiliate assistant professor of pharmacy at Northeastern University School of Pharmacy in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm responsible for teaching their pharmacy students pharmacoeconomics and how to use it in a practical day-to-day basis. So, so next slide. The discussion outline for today is, I want to first start just by looking very briefly Economics 101, and this is market structure, looking at the key concepts of supply and demand. Because when I look at patient organizations and when I look at healthcare systems in general, I look at it through a lens of economic policy, economic structures. There are different disciplines or different themes that you can look at healthcare systems. Economics is one, social policy is another one, ethics is another one, philosophy is another area, or just purely health systems, or this biopsychosocial model in medical systems to look at healthcare systems. I have a very particular view of healthcare, and as I mentioned, it's based on economics. So I want to start off just very briefly talking about supply and demand and how patient organizations fit into this structure. The second is to look at what health technology assessment is. I want to revisit the definition, because I think it's very useful to use that as a departure point to discuss how the evolving and changing HTA framework in Europe articulates with the definition of health technology assessment, or there are departures, and I'll address these themes. The third objective is talking about the repositioning of patient organizations, and this is the major thrust for today's presentation, because I think there's a good story to be told of how patient organizations could change in their orientation under a new HTA framework, particularly around the first theme, which is a prioritization of HTA activities, considering horizontal versus vertical equity. The second theme that I wanted to address is price negotiation under the new HTA framework, so it's centralized versus decentralized price negotiations. The third theme is aggregating patient demand to either activate or deactivate markets. And the fourth theme is cost-benefit analysis, just looking at the different public policy options and how can we get a better feel for which of these options is going to generate the best returns for society. And the last point on this slide is to leave you with a couple of thoughts on patient organizations transitioning from what to what, and what are those major changes that we need to take place. Slide 3. So the market structure is as simple as having two sets of independent participants, one on the supply side and one on the demand side. And what this graph shows is that in the on the y-axis, so the vertical axis is price. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis is quantity. And all economic theory courses usually start by discussing supply and demand. Demand being the red line, and this is within health healthcare systems refers to patients' necessity for healthcare services and interventions and support based on their healthcare condition. And then from a supply perspective is a group of suppliers, organizations, entities, independent healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, government agencies, all serving as producers of healthcare services that provided to to patients and to the citizenship in general. Where supply and demand meet and where the two lines cross over is considered the equilibrium price, and the P asterisk on the vertical axis is the equilibrium price, and the Q asterisk and on the horizontal axis is the quantity that's demanded. This in very simple terms and theoretical terms is the core structure of any market, healthcare markets, financial services, agriculture, construction industry across the board. And I'll be returning to this idea of supply and demand, because I think in reorienting patient organizations in the future may require to relook at how patient organizations currently engage suppliers of health services, health products, devices, and interventions in healthcare markets, especially given the changes around the HTA framework that's taking place. Next slide. So what is a health technology assessment? The impact Inception Impact Report published in Q4 2017, commissioned by the European Union with the title Strengthening of the EU Cooperation on Health Technology Assessment, put in this very useful definition that across Europe, health technology assessment is considered a multidisciplinary process that summarizes information about the medical, social, economic, and ethical issues related to the use of health technology in a systematic, transparent, unbiased, robust manner. Its aim is to inform the formulation of safe, effective health policies that are patient-focused and seek to achieve best value. I've underlined in this definition economic because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, as I'm interested in approaching this question of patient organizations under an HTA framework from an economic perspective. There's already a lot that can be said about the medical, the social, and the ethical perspective, but I think the economic component in this definition of health technology assessment is important to reconsider. And in that same report, the Inception Impact Assessment, there was an interesting graph that lay out two related processes for the evaluation of new technologies. Under an HTA core model, there are 9 different domains, 4 domains that will be part of a rapid effectiveness assessment of new technologies, and that would include health problem and current use of the technology, description and technical characteristics, safety and clinical effectiveness. And the purpose is to build on the market authorization work that the EMA have already done, but then take it one step further to evaluate the clinical effectiveness of new technologies. As opposed to a full HTA, which encompasses all 9 different HTA core domains, and that includes costs, economic evaluations, ethical analysis, organizational, patient and social aspects, and legal aspects. And this suggests that in the future there may be a need for multi-criteria decision analysis, that economic evaluations are just using a cost per quality adjusted life year, for instance, may be an insufficient criteria to make reimbursement decisions, but rather one would need to look at multi-factorial or multi-variables or several different windows to look at a problem of access to new technologies that may include an ethical criterias, age-related criteria, patient and social aspects. I find it interesting that the definition of health technology assessment, as you already know, encompasses all of these different components, importantly the economic component. However, how we are seeing the HTA framework evolve in Europe is that it significantly excludes the economic pricing and reimbursement elements of a market. And I'll return to this this disparity between the definition and how policy is evolving and excluding pricing and reimbursement, and why I think we need to revisit this point of how price negotiation is done under an HTA framework. Next slide. So this is a personal observation and one grounded in work with patient organizations over a number of years by looking at the structure of the market. And I think the patient organizations will and are transitioning from passive social beneficiaries in healthcare systems to more active economic drivers. I think a majority of activities at the moment, as seen from the perspective of regulators and pharmaceutical companies and hospital groups and public agencies, is that patient organizations and patients in general are passive social beneficiaries. And a case in point is in the proposed regulation for the HTA framework, and then also the policy documents at EU NETA suggest that patients would be engaged on an ad hoc basis and included based on the topic or the technology that is being discussed on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a structured, formalized, continuous process of including patient organizations into decision making. This suggests that from a mindset perspective, regulators and other stakeholders are still very much stuck at seeing patients as passive social beneficiaries. However, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that transitioning patient organizations to being active economic drivers suggests the four themes that I'll be talking during the course of this morning may be a path to being more actively involved, not just through involvement in formulary committees, for instance, or evaluation of new health technologies, or determining what an appropriate patient reported outcome should be in a therapeutic area, but more fundamentally as economic drivers and impacting how markets are structured. Coming back to this idea of supply and demand, that healthcare markets only exist because of the ill health of patients. So it is really a demand-driven healthcare markets in the sense that all of these suppliers would not exist at all if it weren't for patient organizations. And it's this rethinking and reshaping how patient organizations fit into economic structures that would result in patient organizations be more active economic drivers. Next slide. So the first theme that I wanted to share with you is the prioritization of HTA activities. One of the things that public policy makers do is to market authorization of new technologies, and then you get to the stage of doing the pricing and reimbursement through HTA agencies. It can either be a centralized process in the sense that it is all under a single agency, or it can be decentralized in the sense that there are several different agencies involved in the implementation of access. Irrespective of what how it is structured, there's always one important decision criteria that plagues public policy makers, is how to choose which technologies to reimburse and which patients should have access to these technologies based on defined criteria. And this gets to the concept of horizontal versus vertical equity. I think we've been pretty good in the past of in using the cost per quality adjusted life year as an economic measure to compare horizontal equity or allocation of resources across several therapeutic areas. For example, comparing rheumatoid arthritis with cardiovascular disease patients, with colon cancer patients, or head and neck cancer patients. And this cost per quality adjusted life year is a very useful measure to help policymakers in determining how to allocate resources. But it's a purely financial, purely economic measure. It doesn't take into account quality of life criteria. So in a future role for patient organizations, it is assisting policymakers in adding an additional decision criteria on top of the economic evaluation criteria that will facilitate their work, because it has political implications. Policymakers are very much left on their own, for all intents and purposes, to make these very tough economic and political decisions. If patient organizations could insert themselves in the public policy process and offer criteria that is based on good science or based on quality of life assessment of patients, for instance, to facilitate this multi-criteria decision process, it will help public policy makers tremendously to allocate resources efficiently, horizontally and then also vertically. And vertically, that is within therapeutic areas. For instance, colon cancer patients, is there a way to further disaggregate access to new technologies based on patients that have the same indication or the same need for a new technology, either based on age, or based on estimated quality of life outcomes related to the patient, or geographical location. Maybe there's some rationale to add geography into it as well. But to what extent could patient organizations play a more meaningful role in adding this additional layer of decision criteria to help public policy makers in making these decisions? Because they're pretty much on their own at the moment in guiding the way. And it's also about selecting new technologies, that if there is this additional layer developed by patient organizations, then it would send a very clear signal to suppliers in the market that the preference for new technologies lies in areas where the quality of life of patients would be significantly increased. And it could have, if these criteria were available 10, 15 years ago, I think we could have saved a lot of money, resources and budget in the healthcare systems, simply because a lot of Me Too drugs, a lot of drugs where there was no added benefit, no improvement, no significant improvement in the quality of life, extension of overall survival by 3 or 4 months, all of those drugs would have not seen a market simply because they would have not been brought to the market based on the criteria that were already publicly available. So prioritizing HTA activities can improve the sustainability of healthcare markets, can improve the allocation of resources, selection of the new technologies that would be appropriate for doing that. But this role is not one purely for public policy makers. I see patient organizations playing a more, a greater role in this area. And one of the themes that comes up in the public policy conversation on the HTA framework is, what do we focus on? What is the outcome that we're looking at? Are we just purely looking at a budget impact, that we're trying to find new technologies that provides us the lowest cost per outcome? Or are we looking at it from a quality of life perspective? And patient organizations are best positioned to comment on this quality of life measurement using patient reported outcomes and sharing that with public policy makers, right, to assist them then in focusing on what are the important outcomes. The second theme that I want to talk about is price negotiation. So there's, in the HTA framework and proposed regulation, there's already built into the policy framework joint clinical assessments, and this will definitely improve equitable access and improvement to new medicines, but it doesn't address the market efficiency. And it comes back to that graph that I showed about supply and demand and price finding, and where buyers and sellers meet each other in the market to find an equilibrium price. That's in theory how it works. In practice, it's a little bit more nuanced and a lot more complex than that. But where joint clinical assessments is only a first step towards a more robust competitive market. And I think what is absent from the HTA framework is that non-clinical assessment components such as price and reimbursement are are missing. They're just simply not there. And it's clearly stated in several sections of a lot of the policy documents that pricing and reimbursement is a national competence and will not be affected by the current initiative. So if from an efficiency perspective is that you'll have centralized clinical assessments taking place. However, across EU member states, pricing and reimbursement will still reside in the independent HTA agencies. And I think this perpetuates market structure or failures within the market structure and will not improve access to medicines. And let me take it onto the next slide. Let me expand why I think that this idea of price negotiation is a critical element to improve market structures. On this slide, there's a comparison of monopolies, oligopolies, and perfect competition. So a few weeks ago in ESO Lisbon, we discussed the slide, and I'm presenting it here today again, because in healthcare markets, we're seeing mostly monopolies created of new technologies introduced into the market where there's only one single new therapy that's available, and there's a patent period associated with it. Usually the prices are quite high, and there's very low price elasticity. Over the period of the existence of that new technology, it would move from an oligopoly phase into perfect competition, where there are more producers, more alternatives, biosimilars, and generic options that are available. But for new technologies and the purpose for HTA agencies, there would be, in most instances, monopolies in from the supply perspective, right? On to the next slide, by looking at the demand side. This is what demand would look like. So monopsony versus oligopsony versus perfect competition. From a demand side is under monopsony, you have one centralized budget, one large buyer, national healthcare systems across EU member states, with single large buyers would be characterized by this. It moves along oligopsony and perfect competition. However, at the moment, patient organizations, how they fit into the structure is that they are not directly involved in any form of price and reimbursement negotiation with pharmaceutical companies or producers of medical devices or surgical procedures. So they currently represent a diffuse set of proxy buyers that are indirectly involved in this game of supply and demand. And if you go back one slide and you consider that under a situation, economic structure, where there are several patient organizations that are indirectly involved, but you have one single monopoly producer from a supply perspective, this given the structure results in significant power imbalances in the ability of one party to negotiate with another. Given everything that I've just said, the way to address this from a market structure perspective would be to match a monopoly with a monopsony and change the role of patient organizations in the structure. Over to onto the next slide. Okay. And which brings me to the third theme. In changing that structure is aggregating patient demand. Are we really ready for an integrated framework on health technology assessment? Patient organizations, not only in Europe, but also across the world, many of them arise through independent effort. They grow to become larger organizations, some of them regionally representative. In many instances, there are competing patient organizations within the same therapeutic area. The process to address this failure in the market structure of having many indirect buyers of medicines would be to centralize and aggregate or consolidate patient organizations as much as possible to then effectively represent the interests of a large block of interest in the market. For instance, if you look at the Inception Impact Assessment report, the one published in Q4 2017, there was option 4 and option 5 in that report that spoke about the centralization of health technology assessment, not only for rapid effectiveness assessment, but then also for full health technology assessment, because this would generate far greater benefits and returns for society in general. It would also address the market failure and the unbalanced market structure. Many buyers on one end, one single seller on the other end, and rather having one single large HTA agency negotiating with pharmaceutical companies. Why this is seen as a possible threat by many stakeholders is because it's only being looked at from a price perspective. What we need to consider, though, is that in a centralized HTA framework, where there is one single entity acting at the level of the European Union to facilitate clinical assessment, pricing, and reimbursement, is that it can significantly improve the benefits for pharmaceutical companies. For example, the diagnosis rate for patients with familial hypercholesterolemia is at best 10% at the moment, meaning that around 90% of patients are undiagnosed. They are still in the healthcare system. They are consuming significant healthcare resources in cardiovascular events, myocardial infarction, revascularization, ischemic stroke, which all independently result in significant expenditure to healthcare systems. Under a system of aggregating patient demand, if patient organizations in familial hypercholesterolemia identified 100% of the patient population by improving disease awareness, identifying patients in society in collaboration with prescribers to add them to patient registries, then you would have a market comprised of 100% of the patients and not 10% of the patients. The benefit that this brings to pharmaceutical companies is tremendous. The benefit that it brings for patient organizations is also tremendous in the sense that now patients having representing 100% of the demand can more effectively negotiate with suppliers that are representative of new technologies. The same can be said across other therapeutic areas where there's currently an unmet need, where improvement in disease diagnosis can be improved, particularly in rare conditions, and where patients can be formally integrated into patient organizations to expand the demand that is represented at the moment. It will also help in addressing this question of new technologies coming to the market that are simply not effective. They lack any effectiveness. The cost per quality adjusted life year far outweighs the thresholds that are available in every country. Just 2 weeks ago, I was on a call with a senior leader, a hospital pharmacist in the Netherlands, another person in Norway, and then in Portugal, talking about the thresholds. And the one question I had for them is, out of all the health technologies that you assess, how many of them would be below your country threshold and as a proportion, and how many are typically above? And the response that I got was uniform across the board, and these were independent conversations. It wasn't a joint webinar. Is that 80% of new technologies introduced and reimbursed by HTA agencies in these 3 countries are below the threshold. Only 20% are above. So we're looking at a fairly small proportion of those that are not cost effective. But it may be easier to save resources to identify these if the aggregated demand and patient organizations could play a more active role in supporting the introduction of some technologies because it results in improvement in quality of life of a patient, or on the flip side is simply communicating to healthcare markets is that the pipeline for the development of another drug that only improves overall survival by 1 or 2 months is simply not something that patient organizations would support or consider doing. And you only would be able to do that because you have aggregated the demand. You represent 100% of patients that are currently diagnosed with that condition, and you can come to market with those suggestions. And it's about maximizing the quality of life of a patient through patient-reported outcomes. I often see patient-reported outcome measures that are developed without the input of patients themselves. And in practical terms, that means that a questionnaire that is developed to evaluate the quality of life of a patient, patients are not requested to answer those questions, but rather the nurse or the healthcare provider. And it kind of boggles my mind how we can talk about patient-reported outcomes if patients are not directly included in the completion of those quality of life measures. This is not the majority of cases. It certainly applies to some cases. I can understand that in certain circumstances, based on the personal condition and the health state of the patient, he or she would be unable to complete those questionnaires related to quality of life. But those are the exceptions. What we should not be seeing is patient-reported outcomes seen from the perspective of healthcare providers or from other healthcare system stakeholders, because those could not be considered patient-reported. Those are rather proxy patient-reported outcomes. And all of this is to say that in the third theme, aggregating demand, focusing on quality of life of a patient as seen from a patient perspective, removing the wastage in the healthcare system will improve the sustainability of health systems in the future. Currently, there is a lot of wastage taking place in the purchasing within therapeutic areas, across therapeutic areas, within countries and between countries, which gets me to the fourth theme on cost-benefit analysis. Is HTA framework, as we see it today, is highly decentralized, highly fragmented, a lot of duplication taking place. Independent EU member states are evaluating precisely the same technology, and in some instances resulting in very different decisions between jurisdictions, between EU member states. And from an equity perspective and from improving efficiency of healthcare systems, this only perpetuates inequalities between EU member states and patients. And I think there's a lot to be said around the type of structure that is put in place to address these inequalities. Would have to focus on these inequalities, but preferably centralize and harmonize as much as possible the HTA process. From a cost-benefit analysis, is an estimate that we already have and that we often work with, is that the cost for an HTA agency to do a full HTA is approximately 30,000 euros. And for pharmaceutical companies to develop the evidence that are required by HTA agencies is around 100,000 euros, just for one new technology. And if you replicate this across all EU member states for all new products that are introduced into the market, this results in significant expenditure for pharmaceutical companies, also for HTA agencies, because they are duplicating the exact same assessment across countries. And there's a lot of money that could be saved and reallocated in healthcare budgets to better interventions if there is a centralized HTA agency. And it's about optimizing available resources. This idea of centralizing HTA agencies is a subjective one, and it's one that is already mentioned in the Inception Impact Assessment report as the fifth option. They also discuss option 1, 2, 3, and 4 as other possible alternatives. But to be able to answer which of these 5 options would be most cost beneficial would be to work through a scientific process of evaluating the cost benefit of introducing each of these 5 options. What are the costs associated with those programs? What are the anticipated societal benefits of introducing a centralized HTA agency as opposed to a decentralized agency, kind of the status quo that we have at the moment? And can we then make a more informed decision based on a cost-benefit analysis, which of these 5 options would be more efficient? On to the next slide. So the four themes that I've addressed, I'm putting out there as the bridge to connect where patient organizations are at the moment as passive social beneficiaries of healthcare services and healthcare markets, where a lot of the work is kind of permission based, and what I mean by that is patient organizations are in a mode of asking permission of HTA agencies, prescribers, and other groups in society permission to be involved, permission to obtain funding, permission to do activities, permission to move forward on certain policies. And I don't think this permission-based existence of patient organizations in healthcare markets is sustainable, or the future, and thus the need to reposition how we do things. The four themes that I mentioned are the bridges that would move from the left to the right to where we are more active economic drivers. We're already talking this active economic participation, especially around the cost-benefit analysis and cost. It's already included in a lot of our discussions, but I think there's still a lot that can be done around the prioritization of HTA activities, the first theme that I discussed. I think there's a far better role that patient organizations could have in price negotiation, especially in a centralized healthcare markets or centralized HTA agencies. I think there's a much better role that patient organizations can fulfill, and it is clearly within their domain of aggregating patient demand. And I think also patient organizations are in a great place to facilitate the cost-benefit analysis of different HTA options in healthcare markets. So final slide. Thanks very much for listening. The purpose of this presentation was just to share a couple of thoughts with you around the repositioning of patient organizations and how policy in this field could possibly evolve in the future. So thanks so much, Susanna. I appreciate your time and the rest of the listeners.
Thank you so much. Now, meanwhile, I see other people joined, so I don't know what is this background noise, but can I ask Dorica to introduce yourself?
Yes. My name is
Hello,
Dorica.
it's Teodoro here. Teodoro Polaru from WECAN.
I will call you in
Sorry, Dorica.
Before Dorica, thank you. Please, Dorica, go on. Dorica?
Yes, my name is Dorica Adam, and I'm representing Romanian Prader-Willi Association and Romanian National Alliance for Rare Disease and Romanian Rare Cancer, but I'm also a member of the board of EuroDis for 11 years.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Teodora, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Susanna. Hi, everyone. It's Teodoro Polaru here from the International Neuroendocrine Cancer Alliance, serving as Executive Director. Thanks, okay. Joao, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Valentina, I saw I was thinking, since I read your EPF paper, several commonalities in what Joao said. Valentina, do you want to comment on it, or we wait a question before and then you comment?
I have a couple of comments.
Thank you, Valentina. Go on.
So, yeah, we do agree that patient organizations should move towards a more active role in HTA decision making. But of course, we have to keep in mind that it's not an easy exercise. We need also to be acknowledged as equal partners in the decision making. So it doesn't depend only on our willingness to do so. That it's a very hectic environment, how to say. And I have some concerns about the role of patient organizations in pricing and reimbursement decisions. Of course, we have our own views on these topics, but we already face a lot of challenges when it comes to patient involvement in HTA, because many other stakeholders, decision makers, raise the point that our views are biased and there is a conflict of interest, especially when patient organizations are financed by industry. So having a role in pricing and reimbursement, it would even raise the opposition towards us. So we have to be very cautious on this topic.
Sorry, it's Jeffrey Henning. Do you mind if I make a comment on that?
Welcome, Jeffrey. Sorry, you are not in the list. Probably you are not met by computer. Can you introduce yourself again?
Yes, it's Jeffrey Henning from Europa Colon. Thank you very much, Joao. And I think Valentina, it's important to remember that what Joao is offering is a recipe for the future. And I think we would all like to move away from pharmaceutical reimbursement or grants for patient organizations. But I think what he suggested is that we as a community need to come together more closely to try and mirror some of the things that have been suggested to us. And I think that's the opportunity that we have now.
Sure, I do agree on this in principle, but I can say being in Brussels and facing the opposition from other stakeholders in all meetings we attend, I can tell you it's really challenging. So,
but the point, but that's exactly the point. Sorry, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. We don't collaborate sufficiently together. So we're not seen as a large enough population to influence discussion.
Well, I'm not so convinced. I mean, we are involved in the HTA network stakeholder pool together with the Eurordis, with the European Cancer Patient Coalitions, with IDF Europe, and many other organizations. And I can tell you, we do collaborate. And there are a lot of points, especially when it comes to this proposal, where we are quite aligned. Then, of course, the patient community is much larger, and we, of course, welcome and see positively the involvement of many other patient organizations. But at this juncture, I wouldn't say that we are not so united as we should be. This is coming up, especially because we have more challenges ahead.
Can I jump in just to address the question of bias? It's an interesting one, and again, I want to answer it from an economic perspective. Is imagine a market, or imagine a situation where no one is ill, no one develops any cancer, no one has any cardiovascular events, no one's ever diagnosed with rare conditions because every single human is perfectly healthy. It suggests that healthcare markets, ministries of health, healthcare budgets would simply not exist because there's simply no need for healthcare because we're all perfectly healthy. Patient healthcare markets start with and are derived fundamentally from the need of patients, and they are infused with the expectations that patients have, right, in healthcare services, which means that the markets that we currently exist are demand driven. It's driven by the needs of individuals across geographies and across the world. This question of bias is one that derails policy conversations, because if markets are demand driven, and if healthcare markets are based on the needs of patients, the only single legitimate perspective in healthcare markets is the perspective of the patient. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is tangential. Everything should be organized around the needs and expectations that patients have. And how can patient organizations refocus and recapture this perspective is to focus on the quality of life. Patient-reported outcomes that are collected for healthcare professionals are insufficient as an indicator of the quality of life of a patient. Quality of life that is measured from the perspective of an HTA agency is insufficient to be able to answer this perspective. I think the role that patient organizations have in the future to address this question of bias is to be more objective then in collecting quality of life measures and helping healthcare markets move in a direction that improves the quality of life of patients. and I think this is what is missing, is that it may be bias, but it can change based on more objective measures around quality of life. And just if one just focuses on that as a component of improving healthcare markets, it will make a significant difference in the conversation.
It's Kathy Oliver here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I just thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, Joao. I just want to follow on about patient-reported outcomes. One of the difficulties in using patient-reported outcomes for HTA assessments is that there is no standard way across the world internationally of analyzing patient-reported outcomes and quality of life endpoints data in cancer clinical trials. And I just thought it would be helpful for this group to know that there is an initiative working away called CISAQUAL. That's an acronym for Setting International Standards and Analyzing Patient-Reported Outcomes and Quality of Life Endpoints Data. That's a very long title. And they are looking to make recommendations for standardizing how we interpret PRO data across trials, because you can have, you know, the same patient population, the subject of a trial, but two different methods of interpreting their patient-reported outcomes. And so we need to standardize this before we can even use this tool as patient organizations. The other aspect of patient-reported outcomes is there is a lot of missing data that is not captured in clinical trials, either because patients aren't able to fill in the forms, to complete the forms, as you mentioned earlier. It may be healthcare professionals are being a bit lazy in noting them or collecting them or whatever. So I think that there's a big piece of work that needs to be done on this aspect of PROs, and patient groups can help a lot with this by being aware of these problems.
You're quite right, and taking it one step further is, would you be willing as patient organizations to clearly communicate to healthcare stakeholders that you would not accept any new technology that comes to the market that is below a threshold that to improve the quality of life of a patient? For example, let's imagine a patient-reported outcome questionnaire that has a scale of 0 to 10, and the threshold is 5. Any quality of life, any new device that has a quality of life improvement below 5 would not be accepted as a new technology to come onto the market. And ideally, you are targeting anything from 8 to 10 points from a quality of life perspective. Just this idea, in a very kind of simplified and kind of archaic way, would send very clear messages to research and development departments that they could do a better job at developing new technologies that are directly linked to meaningful criteria that impact patients' lives, rather than, you know, kind of new technologies that don't have a significant impact on new therapeutic areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, that kind of scoring system would be very helpful and would be to our advantage. However, there are so many variables at the moment in how PROs are interpreted. It could be quite dangerous if we are inflexible in our approaches until such time as there is a really robust means of interpreting PROs. So I wouldn't want to tie a noose around. I wouldn't want to, you know, subscribe to that immediately, because it may be a little bit premature to have that kind of table or scoring system, because we don't have our act together yet, and neither do the researchers, to be honest.
Is anybody also wanting to comment or ask question?
Hi, this is Kate Morgan from Myeloma Patients Europe. So I just wanted to say that I agree with the principle of improving the quality of life data that we capture during clinical trials, and it's extremely important that that's done. And in addition to this, I think what else is important is capturing so patient preference studies. They're not necessarily within the context of clinical trials, but sort of outside of that, using like tools like multi-criteria decision-making analysis and other types of surveys to really understand what patients value in terms of benefit and risk. I think there's a big role for patient organizations to play in in doing that across the spectrum of diseases, in really signalling to healthcare systems, into HTA bodies, that what patients value. So I think quality of life surveys in trials and also surveys outside are both important.
Yeah.
Hi, it's just Gilly from MPNE. I think, quality of life, absolutely, we need to be getting to a point of view where, it's us externally validating the quality of the tools and not just researchers who are using internally validated tools. I mean, I think we need to be much more involved in there. But I think critically also is that half the problems with our HTA decision making at the moment is lack of quality data. So that's lack of quality data coming from the clinical trials, because of trial design and all kinds of things, but also the small size of trials that are happening now because of cost constraints and all kind of things. And that means, we know that HTAs want to see 10,000 data points to make decent decisions. This is totally impossible out of clinical trials. So we need to be really pushing on proper registries. Patient-driven registries, ideal, but we need to be really getting on top of this, because we are not going to get decision-making as the sustainability of our health systems gets more and more price-driven. We are not going to get these therapies through just with the data that we're getting at the moment. So we need to be on the back of registries.
Any other comment or question? I have a general question both to Joao and Valentina. Both of you perhaps know that I'm coming from pharma. And one thing that I saw in both your presentation and document is, and came to my mind, is how or who, also the EPF document is speaking about criteria, because there are so many patient organizations. Even WECAN, we are already 19 patient organization, and I think it's, in any case, once that still is recognized as legitimate, the patient organization input, how or what are the suggestions to select the criteria? We are speaking also in WECAN about the criteria of differentiating, if you can say, patient expertise. Do you have any suggestion or any work on this that is going on, perhaps at EPF, on selecting or giving a criteria, or any of also of the WECAN member has any idea about that?
Susanna, are we talking about criteria for selection of patients to be involved in the assessment?
Exactly. We are speaking about patient organization input. We are speaking about when and how in different steps of the evaluation.
Yeah, together with the HTA network stakeholder pool involving patients and consumers organizations, we are working on the eligibility criteria of patient organizations to be involved. And of course, we look at the expertise of patient representatives or even individual patients themselves. But this is a bit risky, because I mean it would reduce the opportunity for other organizations to be involved. There are a lot of aspects to be considered, so we are not alone there. The issue is that to be involved, we need more resources, and we are looking at the European Medicines Agency patient involvement structure. So we think that's the path to follow. We think that there are already good practices over there that we may follow. But of course, there is resistance on the HTA body side, because this would be expensive and it would bring more work for them. They would need to have in place a patient involvement unit, which is not always the case, and they would put more money on HTA assessments to make sure that patients can be involved.
And we should remember the conflict of interest.
The conflict of interest is a topic that is well addressed at EMA, and which is not the case yet for HTA bodies. And we know that in UNETA they have a working group on conflict of interest. We asked as patient organizations to be part of these discussions, but this has not happened yet. So I'm waiting to receive some kind of invitation. But I think this is something should be a concept that should be reshaped with the involvement of all stakeholders.
Sorry, this is just Gillies at MPNE again. I think it's very important to remember that we must not get too far away from the primary data source. Yeah, there's a tendency to think that we need to all regroup and get together. I think if each disease area, if you like, knows the value frameworks around their own drugs, if each disease area knows the needs and the quality of life issues of the patients, then yes, then you collaborate within drugs that several disease areas are trying to acquire. I think you've got to really concentrate on the quality of life issues from a really close patient perspective. This is primary data source. The further you get away from that, the further you start talking about agreements that could be made later down the line, then I think you are losing the handle that we as patient groups have at the moment.
If I may add, we are perfectly aware that there are specificities based on, of course, on specific conditions. But here the battle is really getting this proposal approved, which is not self-evident. I mean, we are facing a lot of resistance from member states, especially Germany, France, and some Eastern European countries. So here the point, I mean, also quoting what Jeffrey just said, if we need to be united and make sure that this proposal is approved and be able to work on implementing legislation that will be able to add more nuances on the way patient involvement should be implemented. I mean, as we are now, we don't know whether there will be a regulation on HTA collaboration at EU level.
Sorry, it's Jeffrey. Thank you for that. I think what we need to decide from the WECAN perspective is whether we're going to make a submission. And if we're going to make a submission, who's going to write it and what is basically our standpoint? I certainly like the proposal that the EPF have put forward, and I think a lot of what they say is very relevant and very accurate. And I like certainly the dynamic presentation that Joao has just given us. And I think the important thing that we need to stress is that, you know, on a general level, we have a single market economy going in Europe, but on health, we have a diffused market economy. And really, what this is doing in the long run is causing huge inequalities and inability for patient groups to access, or patients to access medicines and later on technologies and various other things. And I think for me, the most important thing is that we've got a single market economy operating in Europe, but we don't have a single market economy in health. And if we start to speak out about our need for this to be incorporated in the future, and I think we work with the EPF and anybody else who's got these similar messages, we will have a stronger voice and more likely to be able to say, we need to be at the table. We have the rights to be at the table because it's because of us that your market exists.
Let me maybe elaborate on the point, Jeffrey, that you've just mentioned, and give an example. In the area of rare diseases, orphan drugs, the dynamic of patient organizations and how they engage different stakeholders is very different compared to communicable diseases, for instance, HIV, maybe larger oncology, specific therapeutic areas. And it's about patient numbers, and it's about and it's not only about patient numbers, but it's more about the capturing the demand in the market. In Gaucher disease, Pompe, other rare diseases where you use enzyme replacement therapies, the prevalence is so low that it's usually quite easy to identify who the patients are. And if it's 5, 10, 15, maybe 50 patients across the whole of Europe, you're kind of representing 100% of demand. And this is why patient organizations in rare diseases, it's far easier for them to come into the market and say that they want to be directly involved in pricing and reimbursement conversations, or they want to see a reshaping of the HTA framework because patients are not getting access to orphan drugs. This dynamic of identifying patients and aggregating demand is very different in other therapeutic areas, just because I think a better job could be done around identifying the full extent of the market that is there. And why this is so important in healthcare market is that if there's only a single patient organization representing all of colon cancer patients, for instance, in Europe, you have a captive audience, and you can far better then communicate your messages because you are directly linked to the source of demand for the market. You'll be in a stronger negotiating position. You'll be able to do very similar things of what is done in rare diseases. So I think there's a lot more work around disease identification, disease awareness, capturing the patients, better collaboration. The fragmentation amongst patient organizations should also be addressed. I think more consolidation to take place as well, so that we kind of get to this single unified market structure. We have differences of opinion, of course, but it's more how do we structure those differences of opinion under a single aggregated structure.
Hi, sorry, it's Gilly again. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, to me, that's the key issue, because we already know that HTA is not being listened to really by the payers. Yeah, so the pricing and the negotiations for pricings are even undermining the HTAs now. So we need to be in the decision making on the payment, and in order to do that, we need to know our markets. We need to know our subgroupings. We need to know in much more detail directly related to the pricing. HTA is great, and I totally agree we should have a across Europe HTA, but as we've already seen that this is a competence, the pricing is going to always be a competence of the national authorities, and this is where we need to be going, and we need to know ourselves as our market.
Yeah.
And this is Alina from Luce. In order to complement what Gilly was saying about knowing our market, we should have taken into account the fact that there are huge disparities between Western Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
For instance, in Eastern Europe, we don't have cancer registries. So it will be almost impossible to define the market size due to this huge problem. So maybe advocating for reduce these disparities should be the first step, and after that, maybe the other step could be implemented.
Joao, can I ask a question? Sorry, it's Jeffrey again.
Yeah.
On where we don't have registries, would it be sufficiently appropriate if we take a representative of, say, Western countries and aggregated a lung cancer incidence, for example?
You could for purposes of doing a budget impact assessment or evaluating the value of a new technology across Europe. That could be done, and then you could kind of analyze it at a per country level. But if you want to start then being more active economic negotiators in an HTA framework, is you really need to know who those patients are on a named basis within your organizations, because it's as simple as when you go to a negotiating table to talk about pricing and reimbursement or better access, it's you know, either you support a new technology because it results in improving quality of life, or you don't support it because it's just not going to do anything for patients. It's going to waste resources. And our argument is that there are a lot of drugs coming to the market that shouldn't be coming to the market. It's just wasting our time. It's wasting patients' time, HTA agencies' time. It's wasting resources because it's being used by some folks for some reason, and who knows why. But they should not be on the market. It's not the majority. It's only 20%. The majority are definitely efficacious, definitely cost-effective.
I was thinking more in terms of our influence and getting a seat at the table. So in a situation where you don't have numbers, we could extrapolate numbers and therefore come up with a global European number for lung cancer, for example.
Absolutely. You take your epidemiological...
For the purposes of that, the accuracy is not that important.
Absolutely. Take your epidemiological data, extrapolate it across the total population size in Europe, and estimate numbers within a certain range, right? A maximum and a minimum.
Any other comments or questions? Before closing, can I ask Jeff, as organizer and Joao, do you suggest any follow-up after this call? I understand, Jeff, you are proposing a consensus among the WECAN members on how we want to move on this proposal, Commission proposal. I understand correctly?
I would like that we can present a position paper, yes. Okay. And obviously we need to find somebody who will pay for that for us. But I think that it would be, I would like to see a WECAN position, because I think if we don't, cancer is, you know, it is a huge percentage of the disease that burden that we're talking about in Europe. And I think our voice will be missed.
Mm.
I agree that there's value to exploring that option. It's Tudor here. Yeah, I want to echo Jeffrey. And there are a lot of challenges, obviously. Registry is one of them. Access to information and proper coding of the disease. In our case, for more rare cancer, for example, that goes throughout the body. But we have to start from somewhere if we want to be really. I mean, if we want to create impact and have data, we have to come to the bottom of things.
Okay, so I take note of that, and we'll discuss at the next meetings, virtual or by face-to-face, that we will have in WECAN. Any other action point?
Sorry, it's Jeffrey again. Joao or Valentina, do you know when the consultation period closes?
Jeffrey, good question. I don't know. I could look into it and get back to you, but I'm not sure.
Don't worry, I'll be able to find it out. I just thought somebody on the call might know, but I could find it.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's Costas on behalf of Valentina. Because the consultation, you mean for
our comments?
On the commission,
what's the deadline for us to comment?
I mean, by now it's with the council and the parliament. So you would the first report, the first draft report is out of the ENVI committee, which is leading on the proposal. So, and I think the deadline for voting on it is in September. So basically, you have throughout the summer to try to contact MEPs of the ENVI committee.
And can I ask members of the WECAN who are present if they would come back to me about whether they would be interested in coming up with concerted approaches to, and I think probably it's a good idea to approach the biggest bloc that is against this proposal, and that would be Germany, and try to convince German MEPs that this is a good step forward. But I think maybe we could develop a subgroup and work out a way forward. And if anybody on the call would like to come forward and tell me who they are, I will work with them to try and come up with a strategy for influencing outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Germany is not the only issue. I think France is also quite a big issue in there too. And I think with these new changes, with the new AMNOG pricing problems that are going to be being decided on in June in Germany, I think that's going to have a huge impact on this.
If I can just as a external opinion, having spoken with a couple of also German MEPs, I think the problem when it comes to country-specific doubts about the proposal is more at council level. So it would be, I think, more beneficial to me, for example, with health attachés or with the German ministry or the French ministry. I think the kind of battle that the MEPs are fighting is more about medtech and the involvement or not involvement of medtech in the HTA proposal. Because at the moment there are voices asking for all the medical devices not to be included to be excluded from the proposal, and others asking for even more medical devices than the ones that are already in to be automatically included in the HTA. So I think if you want to tackle the country-specific doubts, it's more beneficial to do that at council level rather than at parliament level.
Okay. Should we actually be campaigning to have medical devices removed from this proposal at the moment, just concentrate on medicines to see if it works?
We are not, but that's.
No, I'm just asking the question. I'm not saying that it's a good or bad idea. Okay.
So if going back to the definition of health technology assessment that I presented a little earlier, there's also a definition for health technology, right, which is medical product, medical device, surgical procedures, but then it also includes disease prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and its use in healthcare systems as linked to these technologies. So maybe a broader approach by encompassing all of these health technologies would enable you to then find unique niches for where patient organizations could add value in these different health technologies. And I suspect it's going to be more around disease prevention, disease diagnosis, disease awareness, and just improving the identification of patients within markets to aggregate demand.
Okay, thank you.
There are no other comments or questions, we can close. I think we have, in any case, at least 2 action points. If we can do a position paper, and the second action point is by Jeffrey asking the WECAN members to join him in a work group to work on that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Susanna, just a quick question is, if a best case scenario, if we see a formalized regulation go through and where there is funding allocated for sustained activities around HTA in the future at the level of EU, what would patient organizations do in that instance? And then the other situation is, if any regulation fails, what would patient organizations do in that instance? What would you do out of the 2 different scenarios? Would your approach be different, or would you kind of alter your strategy?
So this is part of what we have to discuss, correct? To understand what are in the different scenario, what will be our position.
That's right. And how would it change based on the potential outcomes of what is happening outside, right?
Well, I think from our side, at least from EPF side, the reason why we do so much emphasis on the primary goal being just for the legislation to pass, even if there is not so much detail about the way that patient organizations are involved. Obviously, we're calling for that as well, but I think that our first aim is to see this legislation passed, because that's a clear message that that health collaboration at the European level has added value, because we don't want to. This might happen.
Working on the patient. Yeah.
Thank you, Costas. I think that's an extremely valuable point, because I think the devil is always in the detail, and if we can get this through, then all sorts of things can happen in the future, but getting it through is the main priority.
And if it fails, what happens then?
Status quo, I guess.
Part of the health program, as it looks to be right now, at least from what we hear, is allocated to HTA collaboration. So I don't know in how far this funding will be shifted to something else within the healthcare sector, or to other funding to things outside of the healthcare sector, which, if the second will be the case, then that would mean that there would ultimately be less funding for the health program at European level. So I don't know what the funding will be, if this funding of what they aim to allocate for now for HTA collaboration, if this will be some other priorities that the Commission will define within the health program, or two completely different programs.
I think there's sorry, this is Gilly from MPNE again. I think there's already been some significant changes just because we felt this stalemate coming up for ages. And I think, patient organizations are already independent, doing independent evaluations of the treatments that they are waiting for. And I think this is a strength that we need to keep pushing, regardless of whether we get a joint HTA or not. We still need to keep pushing this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the last comment that I just wanted to mention is that much of the regulation and much that we're talking about is kind of an external locus of control, in the sense that we're talking about public policy processes that are in the hands of politicians, economic advisors, and other folks. If the locus of control were to be shifted internally, that is focusing within patient organizations, what is it that could be done independent of what is happening out there? And if there is a set of activities that could be activated, then it may significantly change what happens at the level of the EU in general. For example, we've already touched upon one of them, that is quality of life measures. Maybe there's something more that could be done around there that would, based on just looking inwards and doing a better job around that, would significantly reshape how other stakeholders are thinking about healthcare markets. Another one is identifying patients through and including them onto patient registries.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I mean, internal housework, if you like, has to be a lot more data-driven in order that we can then be the driving force behind whatever the decision-making happens at policy level.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, also at the end of the ESO Masterclass, there was, let's say, a lot of question by doctors there that they were asking, help us to collect data, patient data, in a different way. So I think also the comment by Kate is something that patient organization can do independently if this HTA legislation passes or not. Is something that we should do. And changing also the mind of people collecting so-called patient-reported outcomes that are not patient-reported outcomes, or that they are not relevant to the patient. So still this work can be done independently.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it's about a return on engagement. Why would patients give data to a registry if there was not a return on their engagement? They wouldn't. It's as simple as that. So, I mean, and it's up to us as patient organizations to show the relevance of this and to make sure that the patient-reported outcome measures are tools that are actually useful to patients and actually have outcomes and clinically actionable outcomes. This is up to us. This is the only, this is us knowing our disease area.
Lot of food for thought, I think. Okay, so if there are no other comments, I will close. I thank so much Joao for his availability, APF as well. for helping us understanding the European framework. And I will come back with some action, as Jeffrey suggested, with all of you. Thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.